War of the Crims, Chapter 1. So long and thanks for all the fish. The sun glistened brilliantly over my head as a light breeze cooled my face. It was another day in paradise. If paradise meant you were in prison and working to pick cucumbers, where the flies think you're an all-you-can-eat buffet. I've been on the inside for a little over 2 years and it still surprised me how much I hated tasks like this. I longed for computers, air conditioning, or even just a phone of which I could ring whoever I want. I suppose on the upside physically, I changed a lot. I was a lot slimmer than I had been since I was 14. And my hair was cropped short with a lovely hint of recently arrived greys just above my ears. So yes, I now stood picking cucumbers and piling them neatly on top of each other in a bucket. At 28, this certainly wasn't where I thought my life would be. That was the beginning of the end. The last day I was just another prisoner. It only took the end of the world for Eric Lancaster to grow up. So the cucumbers were picked, and as I packed the last box into the storage fridge, I was told that the workday had ended. I made my way slowly back to my unit and then to my cell. It had taken 2 years to get to a minimum security prison I was in now. Having to prove I wasn't violent or a risky prisoner seemed harder than I thought. I was here, and the freedoms, not to mention the food, were brilliant in comparison to the other places I'd been. My cellmate was lying sprawled out on his bed, and it became obvious why people called him Hippo. His robust figure and podgy face gave the essence of a hippopotamus waiting in a lagoon somewhere in Africa. I changed clothes and he didn't even flinch. From green to a slightly different shade of green. I'd been wearing green for the next 7 years and I had been wearing it for 2, so I was pretty used to it by then. Hippo just made an almost inaudible fart noise and turned to face the window. I asked him whether he would actually leave the cell at any point and he just looked away. It had become a little like that. We only stopped arguing about who uses the desk about an hour ago, and that meant we weren't in discussion mode yet. It's the way you get inside, just a little oversensitive to everything. I once had an argument over whether the custard should be moved in the kitchen area and almost got my face punched in. The way I dealt with this stuff was to simply avoid those people until they started talking to me again. Most people were easy to avoid, and then there was one who just seemed never-endingly rant and rave about how great he was, how cool he was, and how many women he'd had sex with. He would loudly and mixed with some kind of physical violence. When we didn't call him dickhead, knobend, cocksucker, he was wildly known as Snatch. I plopped onto my bunk and picked up my book. Nothing soothed my mind like a novel by Douglas Adams. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was a particular favourite of mine since I was a small child. Hippo just kept facing the wall, making the odd noise as our larger framed people generally did. Suddenly the door flew open and in bound the smallest man you'd ever seen. Snatch. Snatch was one of those people who made up for in personality what he lacked in height. Well, he tried anyway. His name was clear because he was constantly talking about a woman's genital area. "Fairy dude, they just declared war. I'm going to kill somebody!" he bellowed at me. Although Snatch didn't mean to be offensive, as a gay man myself, it came across as a little harsh. What most people didn't know was that Snatch was a big old queen himself, and in jail, the most common gay guy was the pretend to be homophobic ones. Sure enough, as I walked into the day room, the television suspended from the wall showed pictures of soldiers, guns, military hardware. A group of us, the oddest bunch of men you ever saw, stood mouths agape as the images flashed in front of our eyes. Images like these gave us very little to say. It was horrifying. The 2 largest nations in the world were now at war. They had agreed not to use nuclear weapons, but tensions were building fast. It all started because North Korea got a little trigger happy with some nukes and threatened South Korea. America backed up the South and paraded themselves around a little bit while China called for calm. It seems that China took the backing of North Korea eventually. Suddenly, one of my mates approached and began asking random questions about the TV. He seemed a little overexcited and was waving his arms about wildly. This is probably why we called him Fozzie, because basically he reminded us a little of a Muppet. His body was slightly rounded while his face was kind and oddly small-nosed. Then from behind, standing up against the wall and simply watching in silence, was Silent Ben, the short and bearded man. He wore a blue singlet that was too long for his height. It gave the perception that he had a long back and tiny little legs. Sunglasses sat permanently over his eyes at all times. He walked up behind Fozzie and just gave him a look of dissatisfaction. Calm down. And he sternly glanced at Fozzie. Fozzie looked at him for a moment, partially shocked at him talking, and partially because he knew that he'd just been acting like his namesake. It looks like World War III, Ben. I'm pretty sure you'd be freaking out. Silent Ben, who had been silent, become slightly less silent, said, I don't need to panic. He paused for effect. I have guns on the outside, lots of guns. And then fell back into place, and I turned to the others. Snatch, Fozzie, and Silent Ben looked at me, and I asked the obvious question. If this is World War III, then why are we still here? The four of us looked at each other for a moment, and then walked back to the small confine of Snatch's cell. Realised it smelled like arse and cigarettes, and then quickly moved into Fozzie's cell. It was immaculately clean, his bed-making skills unsurpassed by any here. Facing each other, we all looked and stared for a moment. If war breaks out, we shouldn't be here, I began, suddenly interrupted by Snatch. Dude, we really need to get the fuck out of here. The news was saying, right? The news was saying that the fuckers are on their way here. First put a call for the Chinese as Australia to shore up the resources. I mean, look. They'll be here soon. We really need to get some AKs and other stuff and fucking kill these guys. Because, man, they'll fucking kill us when we get there. Snatch almost yelled at us. He rambled the situation for what seemed like ages, and suddenly we felt a rumble, like a small earthquake, and we ran outside. In the distance, smoke began to bellow from the hills. The four of us stood there in our prison greens and knew it was time to leave. We grabbed anything we wanted to keep, and in prison, that wasn't much, and began making our way to the gate. We watched through the fence as prison guards began running to their cars. Snatch picked up a large stick and began swinging it around next to him. What the hell are you going to do with that? Fozzie said. Snatch began looking over at one of the larger, more sinister-looking officers. Dude, I'm going to fuck him up so we get his car, he said, grinning, a sinister smile with one tooth missing from the very front. Silent Bev swerved next to Snatch and grabbed the stick from his hands. No, he pronounced. Bad Snatch! I was relieved that we would not hurt this guy. No matter what, he was an officer, he was just doing his job. The relief was short-lived because within 5 seconds, Silent Ben had used the stick he had taken from Snatch to hit the exact officer over the head. I seemed confused and Fozzie just seemed to smirk. Really? I said. What was the point of that? Fozzie placed his hand next to his mouth and pretended to whisper, It's a good car. I looked at him and then back at Silent Ben, who stood there with a bearded grin as Snatch smashed the driver's side window. Silent Ben held up the keys and flashed them in front of Snatch's face. Dude, I like to smash things, he said, waving his hands in a defiant manner, unable to admit that actually he just didn't think. Fozzie reached inside and unlocked the door to climb in, yank out wires from under the hood of the brand new orange Holden Monaro. More explosions went off in the distance as Fozzie hot-wired the car's ignition and it roared to life. We all jumped in. Snatch and I were at the back while Fozzie drove and Silent Ben sat in the front passenger seat. The fan belt squealed as we turned the car a full 360 and headed for the road. So what are we going to do first? I asked the others. They looked around for a moment thinking about their own personal plans, and then finally Fozzie said, Well, I need to find my family and see if they're okay. And Ben nodded in agreement. Snatch and I looked out the back window and suddenly noticed something in the horizon. A few large military vehicles rolled up to the prison, and soldiers that were not our own jumped out with guns and began firing. We looked at each other and then suddenly the war became real. Go faster, Ben said in a monotone voice, unfazed by the pursuing soldiers. Fozzie glanced at him with a worrying brow crossing his face. I've never had a license. I'm kind of shitting my pants, he said. I looked at Snatch, who looked at me, who looked at Silent Ben. Really? I said with a somewhat worried kilt. Silent Ben scowled with annoyance. We'll swap, Ben said, and started to shuffle over. Fozzie began to panic. The vehicle behind them was growing closer, and now they had to swap while still driving. Are you shitting me? He yelled. We fucking won't. And with that defiance, he pushed his foot down on the accelerator. Fozzie, dude, let the professionals drive. I'll get us out of here, Snatch yelled from the back seat. No, Ben said, probably glaring from beneath his black impenetrable sunglasses. A buzzing noise suddenly zipped past us. They had opened fire. Snatch and I ducked down and looked at each other. Ben looked back over my head and must have seen something that gave him the impression that they were aiming at the tyres. "Swerve!" he told Fozzie. The sound of his voice suddenly pitched up. Snatch raised his head to peek over the back seat, and an explosion of the front and the back window's glass flew all around us, and Snatch quickly dropped back down. The glass cut into my exposed arms and the side of my face, and when I dared to glance at Snatch's face, it had blood pouring down the side. He was alive, but it looked like the bullet had skimmed his head. Fozzie and Ben still sat at the front, unwavering in their determination to get the hell out of there. "I'm turning down here," Fozzie said to Ben. The car suddenly flew to the right, sending me flying into Snatch, and I made a note to wear my seatbelt. The road got rough and bumpy. We're on a dirt track, and the bullets had disappeared. "They gone?" Fozzie asked. I looked up, just as Ben looked back. "Looks like it," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. That is when we just drove. For what would have been an hour, we didn't have a destination. We just wanted to find somewhere safe to put down and contemplate what we would do next. Snatch looked terrible. The bullet had cut his head and he was bleeding quite a lot, and I asked if he was okay, and he simply answered with defiance, "Fuck it, doesn't hurt." Silent Ben pointed and we all looked over the bush where a small shack sat. It was quite old and dilapidated, and the front door sat hanging open. Fozzie pulled the car up behind it and we all got out and stood on the front step for a moment. I looked at the place I'd found myself in, and they looked at the people I'd found myself with. Fozzie, Ben, Snatch and myself were covered in cuts from the windows in the car, and all of us had a distant stare. "What do we do now? Start a resistance, run away, stay here till it's over?" I asked. Ben perched himself up against the wall, his arms folded in front of him once again. "Smoke," he said, unfolding his arms and pulling out his pack of rolling papers and tobacco. We all quickly followed and rolled ourselves cigarettes. Then in a cloud of toxic smoke, we smoked ourselves calm. "We need guns," Snatch said, the smoke teetering out of his mouth. Fozzie looked at him, his brow arched in a frown. "Guns, medications, food, and then we need to try and save our families," he said. I looked at them and then thought for a moment. I was all good for them to save their families, and I would help in any way I could, but I knew my family was as dangerous to me as the enemy soldiers. "My family's okay. We'll go and do your families," I said, trying to conceal the concern that was building up inside. "I'm not joining any resistance," Ben said, taking a large suck of his cigarette. Snatch began ranting. "I don't care what we do, man. I want to kill these fuckers dead. I mean, dude, they invaded our country and I just want to fuck these cunts up," Snatch said, holding a smoke while pointing passionately into the air. Then Fozzie looked at Snatch and then back at the group. "Seriously, Snatch, shut the fuck up. We need to know what's going on first. So I say we take the car up to Milson's Point, which should be around here." He looked around, pretending that he knew where we were. "Then we check out how Perth looks. If it looks safe enough for us, we sneak in, then we'll go in. Then we'll decide what we're doing." Ben simply said, "Guns." In the distance, we heard gunfire, and all of us jumped out of our skins. They were miles away, but clearly we had been affected more than we anticipated. We all sat around for a little while. I don't really understand why, but from what I saw the others, it was a way of calming down, letting the events sink in. Snatch wandered around, picking up sticks and piling them up, trying to light a fire by rubbing two sticks together. Ben whistled at Snatch and held out his lighter, flicked on the flame, and it burst to life, and he squatted down and lit the collection of wood. Snatch just walked over to Fozzie with a furious face. Snatch began yelling, "Why aren't we fucking off yet? We should be out there killing these fuckers. Like I want to go fucking cut their fucking ears off and fucking fight them back to our country." "Why don't you just suck a dick?" Ben said, throwing more sticks on the now vibrant fire. Fozzie sat in a pensive thought on a log beside the shack, his eyes wide open and just looking forward. "Movies suck," he said finally. We all looked at him and wondered what that concept came from. Obviously, he'd been running over scenarios in his head. "Why is that?" I asked. Fozzie stood up and began to walk toward the car. "Because they are designed for heroes to win. I've never seen a movie where the crims get out alive. I mean, look at every movie you could possibly imagine. None of them say that any of us will live," he said, leaning against it and looking back at us. Snatch suddenly began talking loudly. "Dude, I'll survive. I was in the Army Cadets, and I learned go, he said until Silent Ben slapped him in the face, sending him to some kind of angry shock, and he stormed off, clutching the side of his face before he exploded. No, he yelled, and then began to talk to Fozzie. We're good. The four of us can get through anything, and if it turns to shit, we can always sacrifice Snatch and make Fairy haul his bits out. We all smiled, the first time in a while for me. The first time I've heard two straighties want to sacrifice a Snatch, I said, then unexpectedly Belly laughed. Snatch began mumbling. Obviously had done less emotional damage than expected, and he clambered back next to us. I'm fucking pissed, eh? He said, the left side of his face red and a little swollen. Fozzie, Ben and I just smiled. You fell into his hand, I said, making a joke because I knew that he would go back crazy if he got any angrier. Ben just stood there with a small grin on his face. I imagine his eyes would have shown immense enjoyment if he only would have taken his sunglasses off for a second. Let's get to Milson's Point and see what we can do from there, Fozzie said, turning and opening the car door. It was almost night time by the time we were standing atop Milson's Point. The sun was setting on the distant horizon, and everything was illuminating a brilliant orange. The city of Perth sat in the distance. Helicopters and jet fighters were swooping around everywhere. Smoke bellowed out of a few of the skyscrapers in the city centre, while small flashes of light seemed to show more to fire in the surrounding suburbs. Huge ships sat perched at the ocean just below the sun. The four of us stood there just staring for a long while. Ben, please, tell me your family lives like way out in the city and a lot of guns, Fozzie asked, breaking the silence. Dude, why do we have to go for Ben's family first? Mine's fucking right there on the way, Snatch bellowed while Ben smirked. Because his family has guns, I said. Ben crossed his arms and smiled fiendishly. And they like me more than you? Snatch went red-faced and his lips pierced. Fuck off, cunt. I'll fucking break you, eh? He said, and they continued yelling at each other. Fozzie and I just looked at each other. Both of you shut the fuck up, Fozzie said, and then turned to Snatch. It's because he has guns, and he is further out than you, so calm down. Ben's brow furrowed, and he turned in his line of sight. His eyes sat focused intensely on the area of his family home, the glasses slanting perched on the end of his nose as he pulled them down. It seems to be clear the mortifier hadn't spread that far out yet. He turned to us and simply raised a thumb and nodded his head in the affirmative. That night, we would drive into the war zone, rescue a man's family, take his guns, and then save everyone we cared about. Somewhat more busy of a night than I was expecting when I woke up this morning. I was more concerned with the never-ending sentence I was doing.